Okay, so welcome. I hope you're all sitting comfortably. So a few days ago, we published a report called The Future of Data-Driven Decision Making. And what we're going to do in this webinar is walk through the sections of that report, and we've got a bit of time, hopefully, at the end that we can use to have a little bit of a discussion. So it would be quite nice if you could maybe line a question or two up or a comment, pop things in the comments box, and then we'll come to them after I've walked us through the report in the form of, we'll probably talk for around half an hour going through the major points that we make in the report. What I would say though is this isn't my report, so this work was principally led by Neil Slater, aided and abetted by Miles Danson and Michael Webb. So I'm channeling Neil and co today, and if you've got any really deep questions, I may not be able to answer them today, but we can pass them back to the guys who produced the report. So without any further ado, let's kick off. One thing actually before I start, I maybe wondered what the image was that we used on the title slide. That's actually all the flights in one day across Europe as seen by NATS, the Air Traffic Control Center. And it gives you a real insight into the extent to which data is dominating our lives now. You think about a busy airport like Heathrow, you get that stuff wrong and there are consequences. And maybe we don't always see those consequences directly when we're dealing with, for instance, student learning outcomes. Sometimes those things are some way down the line. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. So without further ado, I wanted to just mention a couple of things for people who maybe aren't familiar with this tool we're using, which is called Blackboard Collaborate. So when you start it up, you'll see a screen that looks a bit like the one in the slides. You can actually move the bits around. So for instance, if there are lots of people putting comments in, then the comments box suddenly fills up with stuff and you're thinking, what is all this chat going on? You can break that box off. And then you can put that, you can maximize it, you can get a better look at what's going on. So there's a few things like that that you can do, and do feel free to play around with the user interface. And what I'd also say there is, if you are called upon to speak, if we get into the comment session and you put your hand up and you say, I'd like to say something, you need to push that button that I've highlighted there called Talk. And if you haven't already, you would need to set up your audio for maximum benefit. And the audio setup is a little microphone with a red gear next to it that you can see just next to the words audio and video. And we've also got, as I said before, that chat window, and you might find it quite nice to pop a comment in there, pop a question in there, and see if anybody else picks up on it. So, for example, if you think, goodness gracious me, this guy's waffling on about something, I have no idea what he's talking about, do pop a comment in, and if I spot it as I'm talking, I'll come back to it. If we get to the end, we've got some time for discussion, I'll whiz back through any comments and questions that people have posted. So I think that's probably enough for a pre-flight check. What we're going to do today in this presentation part of the session is broken up into 6 chunks. I'd normally do a presentation in 3 chunks, so I think the law of 3s is good, but the report is 6 sections. So we're going to take a little tour through each of the sections. So first of all, let's put this in context. There's a lot of horizon scanning activity goes on. People on this call may be familiar with Gartner's work, with the New Media Consortium, NMC, horizon scan reports. Some of these things are very high level. They're not particularly specific. And what we wanted to do with Jisc's horizon scanning activity was to put it very much in the context of what is Jisc doing that we could do more of, and what should we be doing to help you guys so that 2, 3, 5 years down the line, the things that we're doing are starting to come to fruition and they're delivering really useful results for you. So it's horizon scanning that's grounded and it's with a purpose. So I might go off on a tangent about holidays on Mars, but at the end of the day, we've got to be doing stuff that actually moves the needle for you. And in terms of where that fits in for Jisc, we have been trying to articulate what it is that we do in really 3 key ways. So shared infrastructure and digital services, sector-wide deals, so deals with IT vendors but also with folk like publishers, and advice and guidance. So in each of those 3 areas, we're really looking at to say, right, okay, we've got the kind of next year or 2 lined up. What could we be doing longer term? And whether something that you need to set the wheels in motion now, maybe you won't see the results for quite some time. And a good example of that is standard setting. If you start on a process that involves standard setting, there's a lot of committee activity, there's a lot of people who have to buy into it, particularly when we're talking about IT systems where vendors often take quite a bit of time to agree a standard and then go away and implement it. So those are the kind of things that we might want to set the wheels in motion for today, and then perhaps a few years later on we're starting to reap the benefits from them. And in terms of what Jisc is, if you're not familiar with it, once upon a time Jisc was a committee of the funding councils, but now we're a not-for-profit owned by the sector and driven by the sector's requirements. So we're here to listen to you, and we want to hear what you would like us to do. And that is what we will take away. We will use your steer to prioritize the work that we do. It's important to note as well that there are a lot of you. So we tend to think of our own institutions first and foremost. The UK, for a small island, has an awful lot of universities, colleges, skills providers. And actually through our Janet network we reach out far beyond that, because we also connect schools, we connect some local government, and there's a lot of conversations right now about how the Janet network can be leveraged perhaps to be the network for the whole public sector, or maybe the public sector backbone. But already we reckon that we reach out to about 18 million users. So a lot of these questions, actually the answers to them, the scale of the answers can be quite significant. We might think about the day-to-day, we might think about our own job and our own institution, but some of the things that we're going to talk about today, potentially they have ramifications, they have implications, benefits, I would like to think, that are much wider than just our own day-to-day experiences. So we have, like many organizations, a vision and mission statement. And it's easy to be cynical about these things, but I really find it very helpful to come back to them and say, right, you know, are we making a difference here? Does this move the needle? And so I like to come back to this concept that we want to help the UK to be the most digitally advanced education and research nation in the world, and that really helps me, because I can come back to an activity like this and I can say, right, does this move the needle? Does this make a difference? It'll be very interesting to get your feedback on the points that we raised in the report. And the final point about Jisc is we're doing this obviously as everyone is in a climate of austerity, and in Jisc's terms, that means that we've, over the last few years, practically halved our operating costs. So you can see that our budget is being squeezed, but at the same time, we're finding ways to reduce our operating costs, and that's something that we're quite obsessively focused on. And there's a particular reason for that, is some of you will probably be very aware of. There's a transition from block government funding, principally through the Higher Education Funding Council for England, to a subscription-based model. So subscriptions and what you need from us are playing a bigger and bigger part in everything that we do. and at the same time we're trying to drive those operating costs down. So I won't labour the point, but that's where we're coming from. And we should talk about data-driven decision-making in a nutshell. But what I wanted to do before we really kick off with that is to say that's quite a loaded phrase. And I noticed when we put the report out, a few people said, you know, you've got to be kidding me. Are we going to let machine learning algorithms, we're going to let robots, if you like, decide the outcomes of institutional decision-making processes, students' journeys through the education system? And I think this is the awkward thing about phrases that slip into the vernacular, and we've seen this with, for example, MOOCs, massive online open courses, which now increasingly aren't massive, aren't open, and have become a byword for an online course. So I think when we talk about data-driven decision-making, we should be clear that that is something that can help human beings. It is not something to replace human beings. And I personally feel very deeply about that. But what's our byline? What's the world in which we live now is one of increasing digitalization. That's a horrible word, but it's an unavoidable truth. And anything that can be connected to the internet will be. And in many cases, we don't know yet what business models will arise around that. So we might have at home, we might have something like a connected toothbrush. Maybe those will take off, maybe not. But in the institutional context, we've already been doing this for a long time. We have things like building management systems, which are continually generating data, which very often is being used for a very specific purpose, and potentially has wider ramifications. So there's that question for us. As everything becomes more and more digital, more and more internet connected, what can we do to collect, sift through that data, look for trends, and particularly to use machine learning techniques, which we've recently seen were very successfully exploited by Google with their DeepMind AI. How do we use techniques like that to help us with that day-to-day? And in many cases, that data that we're talking about really would just have been thrown away. We'll use it up to a point, and then we'll throw it away. And that opportunity to draw those inferences and look for those trends maybe gets lost. And in the world of big data, we'll talk a little bit more about what is big data. But in the world of big data, there's a vocabulary and a vernacular that's sprung up. So you will hear people talk about the 4 V's of big data: volume, variety, velocity, and veracity. If your big data is from millions and millions of customer interactions with an online store, for example, if you're Amazon, it's indisputable. Your data is big. There's no two ways about it. So volume is very, very clearly right up there. For institutions, I think this question about what constitutes big data is a very interesting one. How big does your data need to be in order for it to be big data? And what we suggest in the report is that there's a particular issue that arises, which is when the tools and techniques that you have historically used don't scale to the purpose that you're trying to put them to in this new world. So let's imagine that you have several million entries from interactions in your virtual learning environment's logs. All the time when a student interacts with a virtual learning environment, every time they click on a link, that is recorded somewhere. Are your tools and techniques up to the job of processing several million interactions over the course of a 12-month period, and then picture tens of millions over the course of perhaps a 3-year course, a 3-year degree perhaps? Maybe not. Maybe you need to use dedicated big data tools for that. And let's imagine that you are Amazon. There's a nice picture here of an Amazon warehouse. all the time, Amazon are in a permanent feedback loop. Every single thing that happens within the firm is used to iteratively refine and improve every element of what that firm does. And of course, that's rapidly becoming the norm in the UK. We've seen this in areas like supermarkets, and Tesco and dunnhumby very famously pioneered this. What are the equivalents in the education sector? And we can talk about things like predictive analytics. So we can maybe give tutors and students a little bit of a message that, oh dear, it's not looking too good. Here's what you could do to help bring this situation back to one where perhaps the student is less likely to drop out or their learning outcomes could be better. Perhaps we could use the data that we're gathering, maybe even just incidentally, to help just give a student a little bit of a hint that, it's looking like, from all that we see, all that we've learnt about you, it's looking like out of the various choices that are open to you on the pathway that you are currently on, optional modules or what have you, perhaps it looks like you might really be quite well suited to doing this one, and this one. So that pathway planning is very interesting. And then adaptive learning, which we'll do a whole Horizon Scan report on this one topic, probably a bit later on this year. The idea that everyone comes to the lecture, they get the notes, they do the tests, and it is the same for everyone. Perhaps we can be a little bit smarter about that, and perhaps the technology that we have at our fingertips can be used to personalize that learning experience and adapt it so that it better caters for the way that individuals learn. And you'll notice I didn't say the phrase learning styles there, which has become a little bit overrated. But it's clear that people have different preferences. And perhaps the way that we use data can help steer the way that institutions support learners and the way perhaps that individual tutors get a little bit of a heads up to say, actually, do you know what? Here's a person that's got a preference for face-to-face interaction. Here's a person who has a preference for snacking on online content, and give the tutor a little bit of a steer to say, oh, here's ways that you can best support those people. So here, those are a few things, and I talked about the learner dimension particularly, but I think it's important to note that we've already, for the longest time, been collecting data institutionally to help in institutional planning processes and also to help in things like statistical returns. And there is a question, are we making the best use of that data? So we'll come back to that in a little while. Big question then. So all this is going on. What are the implications for institutions? So I'll spend a couple of moments talking about that. Many institutions have some sort of business intelligence data warehouse facility, and actually increasingly learning analytics facilities. And there is the question again about the tools and techniques that you are already using. The number of times that you hear that world economies, major countries' economies have a significant element of Excel spreadsheets driving them. Everybody has their favorite horror story about an Access database or an Excel spreadsheet that serves some crucial business function that then inexplicably became corrupt or just couldn't cope anymore with the volume of stuff that people were putting into it or the demands that were being made of it. So again, we've got that concept of the tools and techniques that you are familiar with. Perhaps they're just not quite cutting it anymore. And if we feel that that is the case, then big data as an area, it has a lexicon of its own. It has software, hardware, it has an ecosystem of vendors who would like to sell institutions products in this space. How do you best gear yourselves up if you have recognized that you have that need? How do you best gear yourselves up to meet it? So these are the kind of questions that we see that institutions are increasingly asking themselves. And in big data terminology, there's this wonderful phrase, the data lake. So in historical terms, we might have said, oh, well, I need a database of this, or I need a database of that. In the big data lexicon, the data lake is kind of a dumping ground. It's a dumping ground for all sorts of different data, which you will then come back to and work out how you can structure it, how you can use it in a way which adds genuine value. So it's all about correlation versus causation, and actually knowing that you are making a meaningful correlation rather than, let's say, the price of butter influences the way that people vote or something like that. You can do all kinds of spurious correlations. So how do we know that the correlation is a meaningful one? Well, these are all things to grapple with. That onion diagram on the right, I thought I'd blow it up because it has some quite nice stuff in it. These are some examples of touch points that a student might have with the institution. So all of these things potentially are opportunities to gather data which you can use to help in the decision-making process. And this is from a Jisc report from a couple of years ago, which you'll see linked to in the Horizon Scan report. So all of the obvious things, we've got VLE access, footfall in libraries, attendance monitoring if you have some sort of structured approach to attendance monitoring. And then there's a whole raft of, particularly the stuff around the edge of the onion, the outside, where there are all sorts of interactions with the institution, which maybe there's no data at all being captured for. Maybe there is data, but that data lives off in a space that perhaps if you're an institutional planning officer, something like that, you wouldn't even maybe realize exists, or that it maybe wouldn't have been obvious could be used to generate some useful insights. So all of those things are a wonderful example for me actually is car parking. And you could say car parking as a proxy for physical presence at the institution, which you can measure in many other ways. If somebody's really not turning up that often, do you actually need an attendance monitoring system? Or perhaps can you infer in a more rough way a little bit of information about their level of attendance, their level of presence at the institution from some of these factors like car parking, like access to barrier systems, swipe card systems, and door controls. These things which are sat there all the time, they're digital systems. They record data. The data isn't necessarily used for anything useful. And of course, the big question in here is, do you have permission? I'll come back to that. So going back to the implications for institutions, I wanted to pull out a couple of examples there from the onion diagram. But realistically, what does this mean? Well, let's say I'm working in the IT department. Maybe I don't know how to do any of this. Maybe I actually, not only do I need the infrastructure, but I also need to learn, or my staff need to learn, how best to support it. So there's a whole piece there. That is not trivial in itself. But also, if I am a planner who is used to, let's say, annual cycles, and institutions love annual cycles, it's about Easter time, we're getting into the budget planning cycle, and so on and so forth. Getting used to a world where you could, at any point in time, nip into this data lake and generate some meaningful data about the state of play right now. We're starting to see this in particular areas, obviously recruitment being a huge one. But how do we do this across the board? And I was very taken by an example from Cisco, who are able, so they state, to simulate a year-end at any moment. So they can just press a button and they get a whole breakdown of their business unit's performance, which would normally be the stuff of annual reports, quarterly reports, and earnings calls and what have you. They just want to get a little snapshot right now. How are we doing? We're halfway through the quarter. What's it looking like right now? Well, they can do that. And if these trends are maintained, where will we end up? Where will we end up at the end of the quarter or the end of the year? So this is very interesting. But we talked about students a fair bit before. Having more information, having better information. If I was a student now, particularly if I was paying £9,000 a year to study for a degree, I think I would relish knowing how the institution thinks I am doing. So how does how I am doing compare with the other folk in my cohort? How does it compare with previous years? Is there something I need to do? Oh, again, we'll come back to that one. And if I'm a lecturer, well, I walk into a room and there's 250 students in there. Odds are I can't really get to know them that well. Back in the days of smaller classes and tutorial groups, I could sit down and I could get to know most of my students reasonably well. Somehow or other, we need to use the technology to help us to deal with that situation of those large class sizes where the tutor will probably only have a hazy understanding of, I'm pretty confident that these people over here are doing well. They always ask me questions, they're quite insightful, their work is always in on time. Then there's a whole mass of other people I just don't know. There's a guy who's always asleep, of course. He comes in, he sits down, and then 5 minutes later he's fallen asleep. Must have had a hard night last night. But then there's that, the middle of the bell curve. Where are they actually? Where will they end up? So maybe we could use these techniques to help tutors, to help lecturers as well. And we've picked out a few examples which I call them success stories. You could have called them case studies. Realistically, it's quite interesting to see how these things pan out when you try to do some of the stuff that I've been talking about. So, for example, Nottingham-Trent University put up a dashboard that captures many of those interactions that we've been talking about in the earlier portion of this webinar. And you can see some examples of some screenshots from the dashboard software. In the report itself, there's also a link to a case study that we did with Nottingham-Trent that goes into quite a bit of detail about how it works, how people have received it, and the benefits that the institution has seen from putting it in. So simple things, a tutor dashboard that lets you get a little bit of an idea about how your students are progressing. What about that individual student? What do we know about that student? Let's imagine I've got that student coming to sit down with me for a tutorial. I'll just get a little bit of information about how they're doing. And actually, if I am that student, how is the university's impression of how I'm doing, which of course could be flawed, could be that they don't have all the data, but the university's impression of how I'm doing, how does that compare with my cohort overall? So these kinds of questions, having visibility of that. Historically, how would you have done that? Or maybe wait until after an assessment. Hopefully it's not a summative assessment, because it could be a bit too late then. Quite nice to think that actually you could have that information on a little bit of a rolling basis. So as you get set individual assignments, for example, as you do group projects and what have you, it all builds up. So it's not just the summative assessment, it's also the kind of rolling profile of all of those data points that potentially could be aggregated together. And attendance, presence on campus, interaction with systems like the VLE and the library catalog, these are all grist for the mill. And what does it lead up to ultimately? Well, maybe it's something a little bit like a traffic light system. So, we think you're doing pretty good, keep it up. And if you're not, if we think you might be able to do better, or we might be able to help you, well, what could we do about that? So in an ideal world, actually leading to some concrete advice and, perhaps a little bit of tutoring that's not necessarily driven by a human being, but is supported by a human being. So canned strategies to help you study, to help you get better results. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And I had the onion diagram earlier on. This is from a case study at Manchester Metropolitan University, where they've been looking at the opportunities to get data into their data warehouse. So all of the places that we could be gathering data from to pop into that quote-unquote data lake. And I quite like this tube map analogy, because a lot of this really is about the student journey. It's about, well, at this point in the journey, these are the parts of the institution that you're going to be interacting with. We can ask that question, for example, at admissions, at enrollment. Is there data that we're not capturing right now that if we were, could make a material difference? And obviously, further down the line, things like NSS scores, they are so far after the event. We could have made a real difference to that student's perception. If we'd known that they thought the facilities were rubbish, if we'd known that in advance, what could we have done about it? So there are all these kinds of questions that that we can start to pick away at if we have the data. Another example that we picked out in the report is Bridgewater College's student portal, where as well as warning people about poor attendance and poor results and risk of losing the student, they also have this very nice idea about, well, actually, a bit like a badge. If you use a fitness tracker, maybe you get a little notification on your phone to say, brilliant, you've walked 10,000 steps today. What about if we're just doing this on a routine basis to give our students a little heads up that, you did good there. That was something worth celebrating. And you can say a virtual reward, a badge or a trophy that pops up on your phone is no substitute for a good grade at the end of your course. But it can help to reinforce behaviors that we can assert that it might help to reinforce behaviors that we'd like to see, and give the student that all-important heads up that they're doing the right thing. So this is good. And also those questions about where the college sits in relation to other colleges, where students sit in relation to other students nationally. So that all-important level 3 value-added data. And that question about national comparators, again, there's something that we'll come back to just at the end, which is quite relevant to that. So there are examples of people who are using these big data technologies quite successfully. And if you dig deeper into our learning analytics work, you'll see that we've got some examples from around the UK. We've also recently released a report which looks at the state of play globally. So there's some very interesting examples from outside the UK. Let's move on though, and let's take a look at some concrete steps that Jisc has already been taking. And what I'd like to see is whether people feel that we're going in the right direction with this, we can build on this. Are there other things that we should be doing that are perhaps a million miles removed from the two areas that I'll particularly talk about today, which we cover in some more detail in the report, are business intelligence and learning analytics. So let's talk about learning analytics. What we're doing there is working with a number of institutions to try to develop a standard approach to it, which we'll deliver as a shared service. And there's about 10 institutions that are involved in the development of it. And at the last count, I think we had about 50 who have expressed an interest and would like to give it a whirl. And the concept here is that we're doing some of the stuff that I talked about earlier on. We're ingesting data from systems like virtual learning environments, library systems. We're getting data about students and courses from institutions, management information systems or student record systems. Gathering that together, doing some of that analysis, machine learning, algorithmic stuff to see if we can spot trends, make recommendations, etc. Surfacing those to students through an app, and also looking at alert and intervention systems to see if we can actually help both tutors and students to get a little bit of a heads up that perhaps something needs to be done at this point. And we're not just doing this in a vacuum, we're doing this with some quite well-known firms like Tribal and Blackboard, and we're doing that as a result of a procurement. So we didn't just go out and say, hey guys, do you fancy a crack at this? We did a procurement last year, and the requirements for that were co-designed with the community. So we said, right, what could something like this usefully do for you? What are your mandatory requirements? And then what would be the nice to have? So this is going along quite nicely, and as I say, there's lots more information about it in the report. You can get a little sneak preview here of what the student app looks like. And I think for me, this is the acid test, because when I visited an institution, every student seems to be glued to their phone. So if we can help institutions to get key messages across to students about how they're performing in their course and maybe how they could improve their performance in the medium that they best understand and most relate to, then this is really good. I mentioned the big question though, which is consent, which is around permission. And one of the landmark outputs of our learning analytics work is this thing called the Code of Practice for Learning Analytics, which Niels Data drew up. And this fundamental question, if I'm a student, did I sign up to this? Did I sign up to the institution harvesting my data? It's really fascinating to see how different people's opinions are about this, where the institution is doing it versus, let's say, I chose to give my data to a global hyperscale cloud company, somebody like Facebook or Google. So the institution could very easily turn a whole generation of students off the idea of using data to help with recruitment, retention, learning outcomes, if it's not presented right and if there isn't a clear understanding of how that data is going to be used. So that ultimately the students who are consenting to have their data used can be happy that they know what's happening with it and that the university is acting, if you like, in their best interests, or the college. So go take a look at the Code of Practice if you haven't already. I think you'll find if you're trying to introduce one of these initiatives at your own institution, you'll find it really, really helpful. Something else that we're doing is around business intelligence. And you might say, well, business intelligence is quite well established, but there's an interesting kind of gap, and the gap is, in our opinion, the gap is around data innovation when you start to pull lots of disparate data sources together. So the business intelligence that we've seen over, let's say, around a 10-year period, there's been a lot of it which has been very silo-based. And the work that we've been doing with HESA in particular around business intelligence, leading to something that we call Heidi Lab, which is a kind of playground to explore opportunities to mash up different data sources and generate real insights. That's been very interesting to see what's come out of it. The idea that you can jump out of the silos and, as we talked about earlier on, start to introduce data sets that perhaps you were dimly aware that they existed, and you thought, well, maybe that there's something that we could do here. And we've been using a very powerful piece of software called Tableau to do the data analysis and visualization. And Tableau also underlies the HEIDI Plus service from HESA, which we co-developed with HESA. HEIDI Plus replaces the old, much-loved HEIDI service and uses Tableau as its underpinnings. So we hope that by doing this work, we've started to put some underpinnings in place on a national basis that institutions can tap into, and that will help with that data innovation agenda. So learning analytics is part of it, business intelligence is part of it, but there's probably something bigger that we can see those things leading to. And that's where I wanted to wrap up and then hand it over to you guys for any comments or questions. So what could we do in the future? Well, we think three things look quite big. Real-time decision support. In the past, we would have said, oh, do you know what? You've reached the end of your course, and blow me down. Looking back at your grades, etc., there was a little wobble at the end of year one, and if we'd worked intensively at the beginning of year two, perhaps we could have recovered from that. But as it is, that set the pattern for everything that was to come. What if you had a virtual sharp-elbowed parent, or a virtual helicopter parent, if you like? Many students, of course, have real helicopter parents, but what if the institution was doing a little bit to just give you that nudge? And maybe something like the Learning Analytics app that I showed you earlier on. It gives us a little bit of a kind of marker, a starting point. And similarly, the work that Nottingham Trent have been doing, maybe those things give us a little bit of a clue as to how that could work. Also talked about that annual cycle. And the truth of the matter is that the world is changing so rapidly now. If you are locked into annual cycles, then a whole raft of things can happen that you aren't prepared for, because we don't do that. It's a fixed point in the year that we do these particular things. So perhaps through data innovation, we can actually respond in a more agile way to emerging events. And I say this as somebody who's been following the developments with national colleges, the white paper for higher education, which is expected very soon. It seems like almost every week there's a new development, if only in the governmental landscape, we could say, which has significant ramifications for research and education. So how do we respond in a more agile way, proactive way to these things? How can we use the data that comes in as it comes in? So maybe there's something there. And a particular example of that, if you picture, is historically, we might have said, well, we have student quotas, number controls in higher education. We get fined if we recruit too many students, so we're not going to do that. And now the gloves are off, and we might well say, well, actually, we want to recruit significantly more than we would have previously. We're not going to turn anybody away if they've got the grades, but that perhaps leads to an over-recruitment situation where a lab-based course, a STEM course, if you like, just doesn't have the facilities anymore. How do we rapidly turn something around so that we can say, okay, we're going to use those facilities in a smarter way? These are the kinds of questions that the data can help us to answer. And for my second of my three big ideas in today's webinar, we have a tool called Financial X-Ray, which has been very popular with IT managers. And Financial X-Ray lets you, as an IT manager, better understand your cost of providing a service. And historically, we've often seen that things like power costs, for example, aren't necessarily included in the IT budget. Air conditioning for equipment isn't necessarily included in the IT budget. Space costs, which might not be an issue if you have a campus out in a field somewhere. Let's say your campus is central London. Space costs are a real issue. When we start to put all these things together, obviously staff costs are a big part of this too. We can do some like-for-like comparisons, so we can say anonymously, well, here's a couple of similar institutions to you. They're doing this particular service or facility, and you know what? They're doing it for around half what it's costing you, and you get that data, and that's going to be quite powerful. That's going to be quite a useful tool to use to influence institutional decision making, but also to help you understand whether your own processes, your own approach is really fit for purpose anymore. So the question here is, could we take the financial X-ray approach, and is it actually a little bit more general? Is the IT element of it really, that's really useful, and IT obviously is a major spend for most institutions. But perhaps we can apply that same logic in other areas too. And a particular situation that we're seeing around institutions collaborating around research projects, further education institutions going through area review, and in many cases choosing to merge or consolidate. Perhaps it's just the right time for a tool like this to be adapted for us to explore its applicability outside of IT. So there's a second thing. The third thing is perhaps the loftiest and most ambitious goal. What would a data innovation strategy look like? And actually, probably there are a few really kind of nitty-gritty technical things that would help to contribute to that. We have core data sets, but often they're locked away in proprietary systems. If people want to do that kind of peer comparison that I talked about a moment ago, well, actually, we need to get that data out. We need to get it out, and we need to get it into a form where we can make those sorts of comparisons. But actually, just getting one step away from those proprietary systems doesn't just help the institution to benchmark itself against other institutions, but also potentially, if we can do it in a way that involves vendors as well, makes it easier for everybody in the future. So the architecture, for example, that we've been building for the learning analytics service, potentially if you're a vendor, you can just plug into that. And historically, you would have said, oh, I need to get a feed of your courses. I need to get a feed of your students. I need to get all these data feeds off you. Perhaps we can find a way, and driven by that immediate work on the learning analytics project, perhaps we can find a way to service a lot of those integration requirements in a way that is much smarter and vastly reduces the amount of work that both institutions and vendors have to do to get their stuff to play together. And it just coincidentally also supports this benchmarking agenda. So there's that, and I've also suggested here that you could imagine and what we could call an education API, an application programming interface. So if I want to plug into key data that an institution holds, if I want to get that data out, if I want to manipulate it, very often institutions spend large sums of money on consultancy services from firms to develop very bespoke software, because the institution has its own very bespoke and sometimes baroque way of doing things. So maybe there's a little bit that we can do there. In the higher education space, we have the M5 group, which is recently formed, that brings Jisc, HESA, and the QAA together. And this is exactly the sort of thing that we're starting to look at. In fact, we're going to sit down with Universities UK and a few other people next week to start to plot out that data innovation strategy. Could we do something similar in further education and skills? And that's a question that I'm very interested in polling folk from the FE community about. But that's kind of all I had to say, apart from one last thing, which is it's very timely actually. Kieran posted a link on the chat to Southampton's Open Data project, and I coincidentally have put up a slide about about open versus closed data, and this is a nice infographic that the Open Data Institute have done. The point of that is, of the data that we're talking about, what data should be open? And sometimes it's quite a lot of work to cleanse data to make sure there's no personally identifying information in it, and to agree standards for publishing it and sharing it. And what is the payback? How much of the data that you collect could usefully be open, and can we point to particular benefits from it? But that doesn't mean, open doesn't have to mean shared with everybody. There's a sort of stage in the middle, and in the ODI diagram they've very nicely broken that down a little bit. So anyone might have access, but equally there could be some sort of shared access which falls a little bit short of that. So the kind of benchmarking and peer-to-peer comparison, maybe you wouldn't dream of sharing that data as open data, but perhaps you would share it under controlled conditions, particularly if it facilitated an anonymous comparison. So I'm going to stop talking now, but what I'd like to do is to throw it open to you guys. And what you can do, there's a little icon of a hand in the participants list. So if you would like to ask a question, press the little hand button, and then what I'll do is, I say ask a question or make a comment. I'll press the little hand button, and we'll take you in first in, first out order. So press the hand button if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. And if you wanted to leave a comment in the chat window, that's absolutely fine too, and I'll keep an eye on the chat window to see what points people have raised. So over to you. Hands up if you'd like to throw your tuppence halfpenny worth in. So you have a comment from Hazel. Is there an idiot's guide to big data? That's a very good question. Yes. What should feature in an idiot's guide to big data? There's the question I would ask you. Where are you coming from as an individual? Because I think you could say, well, if I'm an IT person, I want to know how to build the infrastructure. I want to know about the languages and technologies that I would use to work with big data. But if you're coming from somewhere very different, for example, if you're a planning officer at an institution, I don't think you would want to know about that. I think you would want to know, what can it do for me? And where are you coming from? So you're an account manager. It's an interesting question. I wondered about this myself. We talk about these things at a high level in the data-driven decision-making report. We link out to a few other resources. I think there is a question there about whether it's useful for Jisc as part of our advice and guidance activity to produce something like that. I know that we probably could not call it a dummies guide for obvious reasons. I wonder if that's something that other people feel would be valuable. If you do, perhaps we could, if I ask you to tick your ticker, if you think that that's a valuable thing. Any other questions or comments that people would like to throw in? So you have a couple of minutes for any more. So Alison has a question about data literacy. Does bigger and better data necessarily report in better informed decision making, I guess you mean? How could institutions be preparing for data literacy? And are there links with building digital capability? I think there absolutely are, and as you may be aware, we're trying to figure out where where we can help institutions to build digital capability. And there's a perception that a lot of this is about learning to use, I don't know how this has sunk in really, but I see it quite a lot, learning to use social media and writing blogs. And of course there's a huge amount more than that, particularly if your world has been Excel and Access databases, and suddenly you have to get to grips with a tool like Tableau, or perhaps a tool like R, which is widely used in the scientific community, but actually you might end up using that in your planning applications too. Those are a world away from the tools of yore. So we've got a comment from Kieran. So issues around resourcing and skills for data mashing. And I think that's a very interesting point. If you've got your data in a form where you can usefully start to process it with a tool, for instance, like Tableau, that's all well and good. Do we need to build up our staff skills to do the mashing up, to do the data extraction and transformation? I think very, very probably we do. So Frankie said there's a cost to collecting data, if only that good data can get lost in the fog. And is a data lake just an excuse for data hoarding? A good point there actually is that there are some classes of data which you're simply not allowed to keep beyond a certain period, and there's a statutory limitation. So if you just willy-nilly threw everything into the data lake, you could actually be storing up a problem for yourself later on. Perhaps that is the sort of useful stuff that we could put into that Dubby's guide. Okay, any more? Any more for any more? I'll give you a couple more moments to add any more comments, or if anybody does want to try the microphone, do put your hand up and I will give you the floor. Okay, well thanks very much everybody for coming. I hope that's been useful. I hope you enjoy the report. Do give us any feedback that you have on the report, and we would love to hear from you about the points that we make in it and the points that I've raised today in the webinar. So thanks very much, and bye for now.